Where the rivers learn to wander, dawn comes softly to the wide plains of the northwest subcontinent. A pale light slides over thorn scrub and river grass, over low sand ridges and dark bands of silt, and over a horizon that seems to breathe. In this country, water does not always keep its promises. Rivers swell, shift, and sometimes over years that feel like a lifetime to a human, quietly choose a different path. The land remembers each choice in layers: clay, sand, salt, and the faint powdered traces of old floods. Long before the Harappan or Indus Valley, cities rose in baked brick and careful geometry. This region was already a meeting place between worlds. To the west, the Iranian plateau and the mountain passes that opened toward Central Asia. To the north, the high ranges that keep their own clocks of snow and meltwater. To the east and south, the great warm plains where monsoon winds gather their strength. Here the Indus River and its tributaries and the seasonal rivers of the Ghaggar-Hakra system once fed broad corridors of life fields that could be coaxed into grain, pastures for cattle and sheep, channels where fish flashed in the sun. In the deep background, the question of Harappan decline begins as a question of foundations. What holds a civilization steady when it stretches across such a wide geography? The Harappan world was never a single city-state with a king on a throne. It was a web of settlements, villages, towns, and great cities linked by shared habits, weights and measures, brick sizes, seals, craft traditions, and ways of arranging streets and drains. It depended on rhythms that could feel eternal: predictable floods, steady trade routes, reliable seasons, the quiet trust that tomorrow's water would come. But this region's history also carries older stories of change. Climatic patterns have shifted here for thousands of years. The monsoon, that vast breathing system of wind and rain, is not fixed like stone. It strengthens and weakens over centuries, and its timing can drift. Glaciers in the mountains expand and retreat. Rivers that once ran perennially can become seasonal. When a community builds its life around water, around planting schedules, grazing cycles, brick kilns, and boat landings, those slow changes are not distant abstractions. They are the difference between surplus and shortage, between a stable town and a restless migration. To understand why the Harappan civilization eventually transformed and dispersed, it helps to picture its environment not as a stage set, but as an active partner, sometimes generous, sometimes unpredictable. Along the Indus, floods could replenish soils, but too much water could break embankments and sweep away storage. Along the Ghaggar-Hakra and other seasonal rivers, the margins between flourishing and failure could be thin. Salt could creep into fields if irrigation was mismanaged or if waters receded. Drought could arrive not with drama, but with a subtle shortening of the rainy season. An absence felt first in the shallow wells, then in the ponds, then in the grain bins. Beyond ecology, the Harappan world existed in a wider landscape of neighbors and distant connections. To the west, Mesopotamian cities kept records of trade with a place they called Meluha, often linked by scholars to the Indus region. Copper, carnelian beads, shells, timber, and other goods moved along sea routes and overland paths. This trade did not only carry materials, it carried expectations. Craftspeople specialized. Towns grew in places that made sense for exchange near river crossings, along caravan routes, by coastal inlets. A civilization that becomes good at trade also becomes slightly vulnerable to trade's disruptions. A stormier sea, a changing political climate in a partner region, or the slow shifting of a river mouth that turns a harbor into mud. And then there is the human element. Quiet, practical, often invisible in the grand summary, yet crucial. A complex urban society rests on agreements: how to allocate water, how to store and distribute grain, how to keep streets clean, how to resolve disputes, how to organize labor for brickmaking and maintenance. Harappan cities are famous for their drains and wells, their careful street grids, and their standardized building materials. These are not the marks of chaos. They are the marks of a culture that valued order, predictability, and shared rules. Yet the more carefully such a system is tuned, the more it may struggle when key assumptions shift, when the river no longer floods as it used to, when trade routes falter, when repeated repairs wear down communal patience, when disease follows standing water, or when people simply decide that life might be easier elsewhere. When older narratives of Harappan decline were written, they sometimes leaned toward dramatic single causes: an invading army, a sudden catastrophe, a single fatal blow. Modern scholarship tends to be more cautious. The evidence suggests a long, uneven transformation rather than one night of collapse. Some cities were abandoned, others shrank, and many people moved eastward and southward into different ecological zones. In that movement, the civilization did not vanish like smoke. It changed shape. Urban life became less concentrated. Certain crafts altered. The great standardized system loosened. The reasons for this were likely layered. Environmental change, shifting rivers, changing monsoon patterns, possible disruptions in trade, local social stresses, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining large urban centers in an era when the world's climate and waterways were subtly rearranging themselves. If you listen closely to this story, you can hear it in the sound of water, the slow, patient reshaping of channels, the quiet drying of a seasonal river, the sudden violence of an unexpected flood, the long silence of a delayed monsoon. Decline, in the Harappan case, is not only a human drama, it is also a conversation between people and landscape carried out over centuries. For now, let the morning brighten, let the plains wake gently. In the next part, the first Harappan communities will begin to gather their strengths, learning how to live with these rivers, how to measure and build, and how to turn a shifting land into the foundation of one of the ancient world's most remarkable urban cultures. From villages to brick and order. Before there were broad avenues and carefully laid drains, there were small communities living close to the edges of water and soil. The earliest roots of the Harappan world lie in a long process of settling, experimenting, and adapting. Farmers and herders learning which crops suited, which soils, which animals thrived, in which pastures, and how to store food through the lean months. In places like Mehrgarh, to the west of the Indus plain, people were cultivating wheat and barley and keeping livestock thousands of years before the great cities rose. These early settlements were not yet Harappan cities, but they were part of the same slow unfolding, a widening knowledge of landscapes, seasons, and materials. As generations passed, networks thickened. People moved along river corridors and foothill routes. Ideas traveled with them, ways of shaping pottery, patterns of ornament, techniques for working stone and copper. Communities began to specialize. Some places were good for farming, others for grazing, others for access to stone or metal. Over time, these differences created reasons to exchange goods, and exchange created reasons to meet, and meeting created reasons to build larger, more permanent settlements. The Indus region offered a kind of fertile, ambiguity-rich possibilities paired with uncertainties. Floodplains could yield abundance, but they demanded attention. Rivers could nourish fields, but they could also wander. Successful communities learned flexibility, planting in ways that could tolerate variation, spreading risk across different crops, and keeping herds that could be moved when pastures changed. They dug wells, built small channels, and shaped their lives around water's moods. Gradually, the outlines of an urban tradition appeared. It is one of the Harappan story's most striking features. The steady emergence of order, not necessarily through a visible empire, but through shared cultural practice. Bricks began to be made in standardized ratios. Weights and measures became consistent across wide distances. Seals, small carved objects used to mark goods or identity, appeared with recurring motifs. These are signs of something that goes beyond local custom. They suggest a broad agreement about how to build, how to trade, and how to recognize belonging. Cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro would later become famous, but in these formative centuries, many settlements were growing in size and complexity. Some were positioned at strategic crossings. Others stood near fertile fields. Still others lay along routes that linked inland regions to the coast. The Harappan world, even as it formed, was not a single line, but a woven cloth threads, crossing and reinforcing one another. Within this world, craft and economy became more sophisticated. Copper and bronze tools circulated. Bead making, especially in carnelian, reached a level of refinement that suggests specialized artisans working in dedicated workshops. Shell ornaments, likely sourced from coastal regions, moved inland. Pottery styles developed their own quiet elegance, functional, yet decorated enough to show an eye for pattern and balance. And all the while, the landscape was shaping the possibilities. The Indus and its tributaries offered reliable water in many areas, while the seasonal rivers farther east, associated with the Gagar-Hakra system, created corridors that could support dense settlement when conditions were favorable. The monsoon delivered a pulse of rain that could turn dry land green, but its variability encouraged careful planning. In such a setting, urbanism was not a guaranteed outcome. It was an achievement, built gradually through accumulated decisions. When the mature Harappan cities finally emerged, they carried the signature of these long preparations. Streets aligned with a deliberate purpose. Neighborhoods were arranged with a sense of flow. Public spaces were separated from private ones. There were wells and drains, and a deep interest in cleanliness and water management. These features were not decorative. They were practical responses to dense living ways to reduce disease, manage waste, and keep a city functional through heat, rain, and flood. Yet, even at the moment of rise, the seeds of later vulnerability were quietly present, simply because success creates dependence. A city that draws people into tight, organized spaces must continually supply them with food, water, fuel, and materials. It must maintain drains, repair walls, keep wells from silting, and regulate water use. It must also preserve trust that the stored grain is safe, that trade will continue, that the seasons will not fail too often in a row. As Harappan society moved toward its peak, it was building not only cities, but a way of life finely attuned to certain ecological and economic assumptions. Those assumptions held for centuries, long enough to feel permanent. But permanence in the ancient world is often only the length of a human memory. The mature civilization will take shape in full its cities, its trade, its daily rhythms, and we will begin to sense how such remarkable order could, slowly and quietly, begin to loosen when the world around it started to change. The city at its quiet height. Imagine an afternoon in a mature Harappan city when the light has grown soft and dusty and the heat is beginning to ease. The streets are straight and steady underfoot, paved in hard-packed earth and lined with walls of baked brick. There is a calm to the layout, a feeling that the city was planned with thought rather than improvised with haste. At corners and along lanes, drains run with a modest purpose, carrying away wastewater so that living spaces stay clean. Wells stand like steady companion cylinders of brick descending into the earth, offering water that does not depend solely on the river's mood. There is no single palace dominating the skyline in the way later empires would build them, no obvious carved monuments shouting royal names across the centuries. Instead, Harappan power seems to have been expressed through systems, standardized bricks, regulated weights, orderly streets, and a shared culture visible in seals and craft goods. This is part of what makes the civilization feel both intimate and enigmatic. It suggests coordination without the usual dramatic symbols of kingship. In homes, daily life unfolds with quiet routines. Grain is ground, pots are filled, cloth is woven. Children drift between doorways, and elders sit in shaded spaces where the air moves slowly. Artisans work with patient skill drilling beads with fine tools, shaping metal, carving seals with animals and symbols that still resist easy interpretation. Merchants oversee bundles of goods destined for distant places, perhaps downriver toward the sea, perhaps along caravan routes toward the west. Beyond the city walls, fields and grazing lands spread outward, stitched with paths and irrigation channels. Farmers watch the sky with the practiced attention of people who know that rain can be generous or late. Herds are moved between pastures. Fishing continues in waterways where it is possible. Wood is gathered for fuel. Clay is dug for bricks and pottery. This mature Harappan world, at its height, often placed roughly in the 3rd millennium BCE, was wide. Settlements spread across a vast territory, from inland plains to coastal regions, from river valleys to the edges of deserts. Such breadth provided strength. If one area suffered a bad season, another might do better. If a resource was scarce locally, trade could bring it. Diversity in geography can be a kind of resilience. But breadth also creates complexity. A web must be maintained. Roads and river routes must remain usable. Standard measures must be trusted. Coastal and inland connections must continue. When a civilization relies on many nodes rather than one center, its decline does not arrive as a single dramatic fall. It arrives as fraying, some nodes weakening, some routes becoming less reliable, some standards becoming less strictly followed. Trade, in particular, brought both wealth and exposure. The Harappan civilization seems to have had contact with regions far to the west, including Mesopotamia, and with areas of Central Asia. Goods like carnelian beads and possibly cotton textiles moved outward. Metals and other materials moved inward. Such exchanges supported specialized crafts and urban prosperity. Yet trade networks are sensitive to change. A shift in political conditions in distant lands, a disruption in shipping, or even a gradual silting of river mouths and coastal inlets can reroute commerce. When trade thins, cities that once thrived on exchange may find themselves leaning more heavily on local resources. Then there is water, the most constant character in the story. Harappan cities often sat near rivers or relied on wells that tapped groundwater replenished by seasonal rains and flooding. Their agriculture depended on a delicate partnership with the monsoon and river regimes. During a stable climatic period, such systems can flourish for centuries. But evidence increasingly suggests that, over the long span, monsoon patterns shifted and certain river systems changed their behavior. Some channels migrating, some becoming less reliable, some perhaps drying into seasonality. A city built near a river that slowly moves away, or a settlement dependent on a seasonal river that becomes more erratic, faces a practical dilemma: invest in costly adaptation or relocate. Adaptation is possible. People can dig new wells, shift fields, redesign canals, adjust crop choices. But adaptation has a price. It requires coordinated labor, shared agreement, and time. If changes come repeatedly, floods followed by droughts, repairs followed by another failure, confidence can erode. A community begins to ask whether it is worth maintaining dense urban life when the countryside might offer more flexible survival. There are also the quiet stresses of urban density itself. Cities concentrate people and waste. They require careful water management to prevent disease. A disruption in drainage or clean water can lead to illness. The archaeological record is not a diary of fevers and coughs, yet the logic of settlement tells us that public health would have been an ongoing concern. If environmental instability increased standing water or contaminated supplies, urban living would become less comfortable, less safe, and less attractive. And still, at the height, the Harappan world feels steady. It is easy standing in that imagined afternoon light to believe that the brick walls will hold, that the drains will continue to run, that the trade routes will stay open, that the rivers will return each year with familiar generosity. This is what makes the later transformation so poignant. It was not a civilization that seemed obviously fragile. It was, in many ways, a civilization built on careful management. We will begin to follow the first signs of strain, not as a sudden disaster, but as subtle changes in water, in settlement patterns, in trade, and in the everyday decisions that slowly guide people away from the great cities and toward a different way of living. The first hairline cracks in the waters. In the life of a river, change is rarely announced. It happens in small adjustments. One bend cut a little deeper after a season of strong flow, one bank collapsing after a night of rain, one channel silting while another quietly sharpens its path. To the people living beside it, a river can seem eternal, even as it is slowly rewriting its own map. And when an entire civilization has placed its fields, roads, wells, and storehouses in conversation with water, those small revisions add up to something that can be felt, first as inconvenience, then as worry, and finally as a new way of life. In the mature Harappan centuries, the cities had learned to live with water's moods. Wells offered steady relief when surface flows were low. Drains and raised foundations helped manage seasonal wetness. Farmers planted in rhythms tuned to floods and rains. But the same archaeological landscape that shows Harappan confidence also hints at a gradual shift in era when the old steadiness began to blur at the edges. One of the most important ideas in understanding Harappan decline is that it was not a single event, but a long transition shaped by several overlapping changes. Among these, the most quietly powerful were changes in climate and rivers, slow enough to unfold over generations, yet relentless enough to outlast any single plan. Many researchers point to a broad weakening of the monsoon after the height of Harappan urbanism. Not a sudden disappearance, but a gradual easing rainfall becoming less reliable, or arriving in a different pattern than before. Even a modest shift in seasonal timing can ripple outward. A late monsoon shortens the growing season. A weaker monsoon reduces groundwater recharge, making wells less dependable over decades. A series of slightly drier years encourages communities to plant more cautiously, to store more, to keep herds closer, to avoid risks. In the Harappan world, where the balance between surplus and scarcity supported cities, those subtle reductions mattered. Surplus is what keeps artisans at their craft benches instead of in the fields. Surplus is what allows people to build and maintain public works, drains, platforms, granaries, walls. When surplus thins, a society does not necessarily collapse. It simply begins to change its priorities. Maintenance is delayed. Repairs become more local, less systematic. Households become more self-reliant and less willing to depend on distant distributions. Alongside the monsoon, the rivers themselves were shifting. The Indus and its tributaries have always been dynamic, and in some regions their channels migrated across the floodplain. A city placed near a river may, over centuries, find that the main flow has edged away. That does not mean water vanishes overnight, but it can mean that the easy access becomes harder. Longer walks, lower water tables, more reliance on wells, and more labor required to carry water for people and animals. Even more significant, perhaps, were changes in the seasonal river systems associated with the Gagar-Hakra corridor. This region, dotted with Harappan sites, appears to have supported dense settlement when water conditions were favorable. But if seasonal flows weakened, whether through reduced monsoon rains, long-term shifts in Himalayan-fed tributaries, or a combination, then communities living along these waterways would face a steady tightening of options. There is a particular kind of stress that comes from gradual drying. It does not create a single dramatic ruin. Instead, it creates a landscape of decisions. A farmer tries a different field. A household digs a deeper well. A village moves its grazing route. A family sends a son to a town nearer a more reliable river. None of these choices are the collapse, yet together, over time, they begin to redraw the human map. In the cities, the first signs might have been felt not in grand institutions, but in everyday textures. The well that once filled quickly now takes longer. The river crossing that was stable becomes uncertain in flood season. A canal silts and must be cleared again and again. The brick kiln requires fuel, but trees are harder to find nearby because the floodplain's vegetation has changed. Small disruptions multiply, and each one asks a question. How much effort should be spent holding the old pattern in place? The Harappan system had strengths: standardization, regional trade, distributed settlement, careful urban design. But its strengths were also commitments. Standardized brick and urban drainage require ongoing coordination. Wells require maintenance and labor. Craft specialization depends on food security and exchange. If climate and rivers begin to undermine food predictability, the system becomes harder to sustain at full scale. This does not mean the Harappans were helpless. Human societies are not passive in the face of environmental change. They adapt, often with remarkable creativity. Farmers can adjust their crops, planting more drought-tolerant varieties, shifting sowing times, diversifying fields. Communities can move to higher ground in flood-prone years or closer to stable water sources in drier ones. Towns can shrink, concentrating their people around wells and secure storage. And this is where the story of decline becomes, in a quiet way, a story of choice. It is tempting to imagine collapse as something that happens to people. But in many ancient transformations, the deeper truth is that people, faced with changing conditions, choose different ways of living. A great city is not only a place, it is a decision renewed every day by thousands of households who agree that city life is worth the labor it demands. When the environment begins to offer fewer assurances, when water becomes less predictable, when harvests become less dependable, those daily renewals become harder. The city's promise weakens. The countryside's flexibility begins to look safer. And so, not in panic but in patient adjustment, some families leave. They join relatives in smaller settlements. They move toward regions where rainfall seems more reliable. They carry their skills, their pottery styles, their craft knowledge with them, even as the old urban centers begin to thin. In the archaeological record, this can appear as a gradual shift in settlement patterns. Some large sites showing signs of reduced activity, while smaller sites multiply or become more prominent elsewhere. It can also appear as changes in building practices, less baked brick, more mud brick or local materials, fewer large civic structures, more modest homes built with immediate needs in mind. All of this is the slow beginning of a transformation, not a sudden catastrophe, but a world in which water, once the steady partner of urban order, begins to speak in a more uncertain voice. And as the rivers continue their patient wandering, another thread tightens alongside them, the thread of exchange. Because when water changes, routes change too. Boat landings shift, crossings become less reliable, and the far-flung networks that once fed Harappan prosperity begin to feel a little more fragile. When trade winds change direction, there is a particular sound that belongs to a thriving trade network. It is not only the creak of carts or the splash of oars, it is the quieter music behind them, the confidence of schedules, the steady arrival of familiar faces, the sense that a distant partner will still be there when your goods reach the far shore. In the Harappan world at its height, that confidence seems to have been part of daily life. Materials that did not belong to one landscape found their way into another. Shell from the sea turned into ornaments far inland. Stone from distant hills became beads polished like small captured sunsets. Metals moved along routes that linked mines, workshops, and markets. And in the west, Mesopotamian records spoke of Meluha, a far place reached by sea, an echo of connection across the Arabian Sea. But trade is like the monsoon. It can feel regular until it begins to shift. When we look for causes of Harappan decline, it is easy to focus on the drama of rivers and climate, because water touches everything. Yet commerce, too, can be a quiet hinge in the life of cities. Harappan urbanism supported specialization craftspeople, bead makers, metal workers, seal carvers, potters whose work was not only for their own neighborhood, but for exchange. The city, in a sense, was a machine for concentration, concentrating labor, knowledge, and production. Trade helped justify that concentration. It gave surplus somewhere to go, and it brought rare materials back in return. If long-distance exchange weakened gradually, unevenly, the consequences would not have arrived as a single, dramatic silence. They would have arrived as thinning, fewer shipments, longer delays, changing prices, workshops producing less of the finest goods, merchants turning their attention inward, households relying more on local materials. There are several gentle ways this could have happened. One begins far beyond the Indus plains. Trade depends on other regions staying stable enough to buy, barter, and receive. In the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, the broader world of the Near East and surrounding regions experienced its own upheavals and shifts, political changes, pressures on cities, and environmental stresses. If the demand for Indus goods fell in distant markets, or if foreign ports and city-states became less reliable partners, the long-distance links that once felt strong could quietly loosen. A beadmaker in an Indus city might not know the details of politics across the sea. They would only feel that fewer orders were coming, that fewer exotic materials arrived to keep the craft thriving. Another pathway lies in geography itself. Rivers that shift do not only affect fields, they affect roads, crossings, and harbors. A river mouth can silt. A coastal inlet can become shallow. A landing place that once welcomed boats might, after decades of sedimentation and changing currents, become awkward or unusable. Overland routes can also change when water sources along the way become less dependable. Trade corridors are often built around dependable stops, wells, river crossings, seasonal grazing grounds. If those begin to fail, caravans may take longer routes or avoid certain regions altogether. The Indus world was broad, and its trade was likely layered local, regional, and long distance. Even if distant exchange with Mesopotamia declined, regional exchange within South Asia could have continued. But long-distance trade often supports the most specialized and prestigious crafts, and it can contribute to urban wealth. When those high-value links weaken, the city's economic texture changes. The fine luxury edge becomes less sharp. Workshops that once produced goods for faraway clients may turn to local needs or close. This shift can also shape social life. In a thriving trade environment, cities become meeting places. People arrive from other regions bringing languages, customs, and news. Merchants gather, not only to exchange goods, but to renew relationships and agreements. If trade thins, the city becomes quieter in a different way. The market still exists, but the variety narrows. The sense of being connected to a wider world dims. The city begins to feel less like a hub and more like a large settlement surviving on its own region. And then there is the matter of trust and standardization, so central to Harappan identity. Shared weights and measures make trade smoother. Seals and marking systems help identify goods, owners, or origins. But if trade networks weaken, the incentive to maintain strict standards can weaken too. Standards are costly. They require agreement and enforcement, whether formal or cultural. If fewer merchants are moving goods across long distances, local variation can creep in. A weight set used in one town may not match another as precisely as before. A seal motif that once felt official may become more regional, more personal, less tied to a wide system. This is not the loss of civilization. It is the loosening of a web. Now imagine a Harappan port settlement on the coast, perhaps in the region where the sea meets tidal flats and mangroves. At its height, boats come and go with the seasons. The air smells of salt and resin and wet wood. Traders inspect goods under simple awnings. Shells are gathered and worked. Inland merchants arrive with bundles of beads and textiles. Far across the water, other ports wait. Then, over decades, the patterns change. The sea route becomes less predictable. Storms, currents, the subtle reshaping of shorelines. The harbor silts, and unloading becomes harder. Or perhaps the demand from across the sea simply fades as foreign cities face their own strains. The port does not vanish overnight. It adapts. It turns inward, becoming more regional. But the sense of outward flow of being part of a far-reaching exchange begins to soften. Back in the great inland cities, the change is felt in work and in choice. A craftsperson who once had consistent trade-driven demand now faces uncertainty. The city's administrators, whoever they were, however they organized, must decide how to respond. Do they invest more in storage and local production? Do they encourage new routes? Do they tighten control to preserve order, or loosen it to allow flexibility? This is where economic change and environmental change begin to braid together. If harvests are less reliable because rains are shifting, then surplus available for trade may shrink. If trade shrinks, then a city's ability to buffer bad harvests through exchange also diminishes. Each stress amplifies the other, gently but persistently. And as that amplification continues, the logic of urban concentration weakens. A large city without strong trade and with less predictable food supply becomes harder to justify. For a household deciding where to raise children, where to keep animals, where to invest labor, the appeal of a smaller community with flexible strategies grows stronger. Villages can move their fields more easily. They can adapt their water sources more quickly. They are less dependent on distant systems that may no longer feel trustworthy. By the end of this part of the story, we can begin to sense how decline does not require invasion or flames. It can emerge from the fading of confidence in water, in harvests, and in exchange. When those three begin to wobble, even the most carefully built city begins to feel heavier, like a structure that demands more and more effort to keep standing. And so, as trade winds change direction and the rivers continue their slow wandering, the Harappan world turns its attention toward the most basic question: how to feed itself under a slightly different sky. Fields under a different sky. The first sign of a changing climate is often not a storm, but a pause. A pause in the rain that should have come by now. A pause in the rise of a river that has always swelled at this point in the season. A pause in the soft green flush that normally spreads across the fields. In such pauses, farmers begin to listen differently to the land. They watch the horizon with a quieter patience. They hold seed back a little longer. They choose sturdier grains. They decide, sometimes with reluctance, to plant less. For the Harappan world, agriculture was not simply an occupation. It was the foundation beneath everything the cities achieved, beneath the brick streets and the bead workshops, beneath the distant trade, beneath the shared standards that tied far settlements together. When fields are steady, cities can flourish. When fields grow uncertain, cities must either adapt or shrink. By the time the mature Harappan urban system began to loosen, the landscape itself seems to have been offering fewer guarantees. A weakening or shifting monsoon would have meant more variable rainfall. River patterns may have altered groundwater recharge and floodplain fertility in different regions. Some areas might still have had good years, even excellent ones, but the overall rhythm may have become less predictable. And unpredictability is its own kind of pressure. It makes planning difficult, and planning is what complex societies do best. In response, the Harappans likely adjusted in ways that were practical, local, and deeply human. One of the clearest adaptive strategies any ancient society can employ is to diversify. Diversify crops, diversify fields, diversify seasonal work. In earlier phases, wheat and barley were important staples in much of the Indus region, especially in areas influenced by winter rainfall patterns. But as conditions changed, communities may have increased their reliance on crops better suited to different rainfall regimes, millets for example, which can be more drought-tolerant and can fit different planting schedules. Shifts like these do not happen in a single year. They happen as knowledge spreads. A neighbor tries a crop that survives a dry spell, and others follow. Another adaptation lies in water management itself. Wells were already a Harappan signature, and in drier or more variable times, wells become even more precious. But wells also demand labor. They must be dug, lined, maintained, and protected. Groundwater levels can drop if recharge declines, making wells deeper and more difficult over generations. If rivers migrate or flood less frequently, the slow replenishment of groundwater can change. A well that served a neighborhood for decades might begin to require deeper digging, or its water might turn brackish in some areas as salts concentrate in drying soils. Salinization salt buildup in agricultural soils is a quiet enemy in many ancient irrigation landscapes. It can occur when water evaporates and leaves salts behind, especially if drainage is poor or if irrigation practices become strained under arid conditions. The Indus plains include regions where this is a long-term risk. If floods become less regular, if farmers rely more on irrigation, or if water tables shift, salts can slowly rise and reduce yields. Unlike a sudden disaster, salinization is a creeping fatigue in the land. Crops grow thinner, fields require more effort, people try new plots farther away. Such pressures would not have affected all regions equally. The Harappan world was large, spanning different ecological zones. Some places may have remained productive while others grew difficult. This unevenness matters because it encourages movement. People drift from less reliable zones toward more reliable ones, toward areas with better rainfall, steadier rivers, or soils that still respond well to cultivation. This is where the story begins to show its eastward and southward pull. As conditions in parts of the Northwest became more variable, communities may have found the eastern regions closer to more consistent monsoon influence more attractive. Not necessarily because the East was lush in a simple sense, but because its rainfall patterns could offer a different kind of reliability. A shift like this is subtle. It begins with seasonal travel, with establishing new fields, with relatives settling in a new area, with marriages linking communities across regions. Over time, it becomes migration, and migration becomes a new map of settlement. In the countryside, the transformation might have looked like this. A farmer who once depended on a particular floodplain begins to plant more on slightly higher ground, less vulnerable to unpredictable floods or waterlogging. Another family increases its herd size relative to its crops, because animals can be moved when rains fail. A community that once maintained an irrigation channel decides it is no longer worth the work when the water flow is unreliable and shifts toward rain-fed fields that depend less on constant management. In cities, these changes are felt through supply. Urban life is sustained by grain and fodder brought in from surrounding areas. If rural production becomes less predictable, cities must lean more heavily on storage and distribution. But storage itself is a gamble. A stored surplus can protect against a bad year, yet building and maintaining storage requires labor and trust. And if bad years repeat, reserves can be exhausted. If a city's hinterland, the surrounding countryside that feeds it, becomes patchier in productivity, the city must either extend its supply networks farther, import more through trade, or accept a smaller population. And by this stage of the Harappan story, trade too is thinning. That means the city has fewer external buffers. It becomes more exposed to local harvest variability. The grand balance that once supported urban concentration begins to wobble. What happens next is not necessarily famine in the dramatic sense. More often, in ancient transitions, it is reorganization. People make careful, sober calculations. They may not speak of collapse, but they feel the tightening of choices. A family in a city neighborhood hears that relatives in a smaller settlement have good grazing and reliable wells. A craftsperson notices that fewer customers come to buy fine goods. A household decides that it is better to live where food is grown than where it must be transported and rationed. Gradually, the countryside becomes more central. The city becomes less magnetic. Houses may still be lived in, streets still walked, wells still drawn from. But the density eases. Public works are maintained less consistently. Some drains clog. Repairs are done by households rather than coordinated groups. The sense of a city as a carefully managed organism begins to fade. Even so, the Harappan tradition does not disappear. It persists in habits, in pottery styles, in craft techniques, in domestic routines, in the memory of how to build with brick and how to measure. It persists in the idea that water matters, that cleanliness matters, that order can be made from complexity. But it is now an order practiced on a smaller scale, in a world where the sky is offering a slightly different pattern of rain. As the fields adjust and the rhythms of farming change, the cities face their most intimate challenge, the slow question of whether urban life, with all its demands, is still worth sustaining in its old form. And in that question, the Harappan decline becomes most visible not as destruction, but as gradual thinning, as people quietly choosing new places and new balances, cities that shrink without a battle. There is a kind of silence that settles over a city when its busiest days have passed. Not the silence of abandonment, not the sudden hush of fear, but the quieter thinning that comes when fewer footsteps take the same streets each morning. A market still opens, but the crowd is smaller. A well is still used, but fewer buckets scrape its rim. A lane that once rang with work and conversation becomes, over time, a place where wind moves more freely. For the Harappan cities, decline was rarely an image of smoke rising from rooftops. It was more often the slow easing of density, the gradual loosening of systems that had once held firm. The cities did not fall with a single blow. They faded through choices, pressures, and the steady arithmetic of maintenance. To understand this, it helps to picture what a large planned Harappan city required, day after day, year after year. It required clean water, not merely present, but accessible in the right places. It required drains that worked, which meant drains that were kept clear. It required streets and walls that did not crumble, which meant bricks that had to be made, moved, and set into place. It required supplies of fuel for cooking and for kilns. It required grain storage and distribution. It required the kind of collective discipline that makes shared infrastructure possible. At the height of Harappan urban life, these requirements were met well enough to create a culture famous even now for its order. But as climate variability increased, and as trade thinned, and as agricultural predictability weakened, those requirements became harder to satisfy. Not impossible, just harder. And when something becomes harder for long enough, people begin to adjust their lives around it. The first signs of shrinking may have been subtle. Certain neighborhoods might have become less occupied. Houses might have been subdivided or repurposed. A large building once maintained as a communal space might have fallen into disrepair and been used differently, or not at all. Crafts that required imported materials might have declined. The city's most specialized workshops, those producing goods for long-distance exchange, might have turned toward more local markets, or faded as demand changed. Urban contraction often looks, archaeologically, like a change in building quality and consistency. In a thriving phase, baked brick is used extensively, standardized in size and ratio, arranged with a disciplined hand. In a phase of strain, people may use more locally available materials. Mud brick, reused brick, patched walls. This is not necessarily a sign of ignorance. It is a sign of priorities. Baked brick is costly. It requires fuel, organized labor, and time. If fuel is scarcer, if labor is diverted to securing food, if long-term confidence is weakening, households will build in ways that meet immediate needs. The most telling aspect of this kind of decline is that it can coexist with normal life. Families still eat, children still play, elders still tell stories. People still marry and trade and worship in whatever forms their culture holds. The city is still a place to live, but the grand collective maintenance that makes a planned city shine begins to dim. Drains clog more often. Streets become rougher. Public works are repaired less uniformly. A sense of shared coordination becomes patchier, perhaps because leadership structures are changing. Perhaps because the incentives to maintain strict standards are weakening. In such a world, migration becomes both a symptom and a cause. When some families leave, the city loses labor and demand. With fewer people, fewer hands are available for communal repair. With fewer customers, specialized crafts become less profitable. As these changes accumulate, the city becomes less attractive to those who remain, and the impulse to leave grows. It is important to remember that leaving is rarely a single moment. It can be seasonal at first. A family might spend part of the year in a smaller settlement closer to fields, returning to the city for trade or social ties. Over time, the balance can shift. The countryside becomes the center of life, and the city becomes a place visited rather than inhabited. In the Harappan context, the geography of decline suggests that some of the most affected areas were those tied to less reliable water systems. If a seasonal river corridor became increasingly dry, settlements along it would have faced growing stress. People would drift toward regions where rainfall or water sources were more dependable. That drift, repeated over generations, could gradually depopulate certain urban centers. And yet, not all Harappan cities would have experienced the same timeline. Some might have remained active longer, especially those with more reliable water access, or those better positioned for regional exchange. Decline in this case is not a single curve but a set of overlapping transitions, some places shrinking sooner, others later, some transforming rather than emptying. What does it feel like from within to live in such a city? Perhaps it feels like more work for the same result. A well must be deepened. A street must be cleared after a flood or after neglect. A storage facility must be guarded more carefully because supplies feel less abundant. Perhaps it feels like uncertainty, not acute fear, but a lingering question about next season's harvest. Perhaps it feels like hearing more stories of relatives who have moved to a place with better grazing, better rainfall, or more opportunity. The Harappan decline also invites us to consider the subtle role of social cohesion. Urban systems function best when people agree to cooperate. When resources become tighter, cooperation can become more difficult. Disputes over water rights, grazing lands, and stored grain can increase. Even small conflicts, arguments between neighborhoods, competition between households, can erode the willingness to contribute to shared projects. A drain is cleared when enough people agree it matters. A wall is repaired when labor can be coordinated. If trust declines, infrastructure declines. But again, the story is not necessarily one of violence. It can be one of gradual disengagement. People turning inward, focusing on household survival rather than city-wide planning. A planned city, without ongoing planning, becomes simply a large settlement. It loses its special character. As urban life loosens, certain cultural markers begin to shift as well. Seals become less common. Standard weights may be used less consistently. The wide network of shared symbols that once tied distant Harappan communities together becomes more regional. Traditions persist, but their uniformity fades. And so, in place of a dramatic fall, we see a slow shrinking, a civilization that steps down from its urban peak into a different form of life. The great cities, once so carefully ordered, become quieter, more uneven, less central. This is not the end of the Harappan people. It is the beginning of a new pattern: smaller settlements, shifting routes, changing crops, and the intimate pressures of health and water in communities that are adjusting to a world where the old assurances no longer hold. We will move closer to the personal scale of decline toward the body, the household, and the city's hidden vulnerabilities. We will consider how water, sanitation, and health, so central to Harappan urban pride, might have become points of strain when climate and maintenance began to falter. Health, water, and the intimate strains of crowding night settles gently over the bricks. In a Harappan city, darkness would have come without the bright, steady lamps of later ages, only small flames, oil-fed and flickering, tucked into sheltered corners. The streets would soften into shadow. The air would cool, and the day's dust would fall slowly to the ground. In such quiet hours, it is easier to imagine the city not as an abstract marvel of planning, but as a living place made of bodies, thousands of human lives, breathing, eating, sleeping, working, and depending on the same wells and drains. When historians speak of decline, they often speak of rivers and trade and politics. Yet for the people who lived through the Harappan transformation, the most persuasive reasons to stay or leave may have been intimate. Was the water clean? Did children fall ill often? Did the neighborhood smell worse than it used to? Did the drains run, or did they clog and pool? In a dense city, small failures can become daily burdens, and daily burdens can shape migration more powerfully than distant events. Harappan cities are famous for their sanitation systems. Drains running along streets, household bathing areas, wells, and a remarkable attention to water control. This attention likely improved quality of life in many ways. Clean water and effective drainage reduce certain diseases. They make dense living possible. They also create a sense of civic pride, a city that feels well kept, orderly, and safe. But sanitation is not a one-time achievement. It is a practice that must be renewed. Drains must be cleared. Waste must be managed. Wells must be protected from contamination. And as environmental conditions shift, if floods become more erratic, if drought lowers groundwater, if people are forced to use less water for cleaning, sanitation can become harder to sustain. Imagine for a moment a neighborhood where the drains have begun to fail. Perhaps silt from unusual floods has clogged channels. Perhaps maintenance has slipped because labor is needed elsewhere, or because fewer households remain to share the work. Water begins to pool after heavy rain. Wastewater lingers. In warm climates, standing water becomes a breeding ground for insects. It also becomes a quiet source of contamination if it seeps into places where people walk and children play. The result is not necessarily an obvious epidemic recorded in writing. There is no Harappan chronicle to tell us of fevers and coughs. But the logic of settlement tells us that health would have been sensitive to these shifts. A city with failing drainage becomes less pleasant, less safe, less worth the effort of urban life. And in an era when other pressures, food uncertainty, trade thinning are already making cities feel heavier, declining sanitation can become the final nudge. Wells, too, can change in character over generations. If groundwater levels drop, wells must be dug deeper. Deeper wells require more labor and skill. If recharge declines, water quality may change, becoming more mineral-rich, perhaps even brackish in some areas where salts accumulate. A well that once tasted sweet might begin to taste sharp. People might need to walk farther for better water, or ration clean water for drinking while using poorer water for washing. Such adjustments affect health in quiet ways. Nutrition is another subtle thread. If harvests become less reliable, or if cities struggle to receive consistent supplies, diets can narrow. Protein from livestock may become harder to secure if grazing lands shift or herds are moved away from cities. Grain stores might be stretched thinner. In good years, urban diets can be varied through trade and specialization. In strained years, diets can become more monotonous, and malnutrition, even mild, can increase susceptibility to disease. There is also the emotional weight of uncertainty. A city thrives when people believe tomorrow will resemble today. When the future feels less predictable, stress rises. Households become cautious. Social relations can strain. Communities that once cooperated on shared projects may find cooperation harder when each household is guarding its own survival. This does not require violence to matter. It requires only the slow erosion of shared confidence. The Harappan decline, in this light, becomes not only an environmental and economic story, but a story about the cost of urban living when the systems that support it begin to falter. Cities are fragile not because they are weak, but because they are dense. Their advantages, specialized labor, shared infrastructure, vibrant markets, depend on stability. When stability declines, density can turn from advantage to burden. In some neighborhoods, people might respond by repairing what they can, patching drains, cleaning channels, organizing water collection more carefully. In others, people might simply adapt by changing their routines, using less water, avoiding certain areas after rain, shifting cooking and washing practices. But these adaptations come with fatigue. Over time, fatigue becomes desire for a different life, one less constrained by the failure of shared infrastructure. This is where smaller settlements begin to look not like a retreat, but like an improvement. In a village, waste is dispersed rather than concentrated. Water use is simpler. If a well fails, the community may move or dig another without the complexity of supporting thousands. Fields are nearby, reducing dependence on long supply chains. If rain fails, herds can be moved more easily. A village can be flexible in a way a city cannot. So, even as Harappan culture persisted, its urban form became less compelling. People carried their skills, outward pottery techniques, bead-making knowledge, ways of organizing domestic space, but they practiced them in smaller worlds. Archaeologically, this shift can appear as a dispersal of population into many small sites, as fewer monumental or city-scale structures, as changes in the kinds of artifacts found. Yet behind these patterns are human motives: a parent choosing cleaner water for a child, a household seeking fields that feel more dependable, a community deciding that the burdens of dense living are no longer worth it. And as more people make these choices, the map of settlement changes. The center of gravity moves away from the old urban heartlands and toward regions that promise a steadier relationship with rainfall and soil. In the next part, we will follow that movement. We will watch the Harappan world's population and cultural energy drift eastward and southward, not as a sudden migration, but as a long, gradual reorientation, like a tree leaning toward the light. A map that redraws itself eastward. There are changes you can see in a single lifetime. New houses, new fields, a road that becomes busier, a river bank that slips a little farther each season. And then there are changes that only become clear when you step back, when you imagine the land as it was in your grandparents' youth, and as it is now, and as it may be when your children are grown. In the Harappan world, one of the most important shifts of the decline period was this kind of change: the slow redrawing of the settlement map, the gradual movement of people and activity away from some of the old urban cores and toward other regions, especially toward the east, and in some places, toward the south. It is tempting to picture such movement as a single migration, a mass departure with carts creaking under bundles and livestock driven in clouds of dust. But the reality was likely softer and more layered. People move for many reasons: marriage ties, seasonal grazing, new opportunities in farming, the pull of relatives already settled elsewhere. Over time, these small movements accumulate until a whole civilization seems to have shifted its weight. The forces guiding this reorientation were practical. If monsoon patterns were changing, then the balance between rain-fed agriculture and river-dependent agriculture would shift as well. Regions that had once supported dense settlement, especially along seasonal river corridors, might become less reliable. Meanwhile, areas with stronger or more consistent monsoon influence could offer a steadier growing season, even if these eastern regions came with their own challenges: different soils, different pests, different cycles. They might have felt more predictable than the tightening landscapes of the Northwest. In such circumstances, the logic of human survival is rarely dramatic. It is simply comparative. A farmer hears that a cousin in a different region has had better harvests for several years. A herder learns of grazing lands that remain green longer into the dry season. A household decides to plant a small field in a new area while still keeping a foothold in the old one. A village sends scouts, not in the military sense, but in the practical sense. People who walk and observe and return with news. The river there is steadier, the wells there are sweet, the soil there is still generous. Over time, new settlements grow. Some may begin as seasonal camps or satellite hamlets. Then they become permanent. As they become permanent, they attract more families. They develop their own wells, their own storage, their own craft production. The old cities are not immediately abandoned, but they lose their monopoly on opportunity. The civilization's energy disperses. This dispersal changes the nature of society itself. A dense urban network supports certain kinds of specialization and coordination. A dispersed network supports different strengths, flexibility, local resilience, regional variation. In the Harappan case, the shift towards smaller settlements may have been both an adaptation and a transformation. It helped people cope with environmental uncertainty, and it also altered the cultural fabric that had once been held together by strong standardization. As populations reoriented, the old Harappan markers, standardized seals, consistent weights, uniform brick sizes, became less central. In smaller settlements, local needs dominate. People build with what is available. They measure by familiar household standards rather than interregional ones. They produce crafts for local exchange rather than for distant markets. The shared language of a wide economic system begins to fragment into dialects still related, still recognizable, but no longer perfectly uniform. Yet the movement eastward and southward does not mean the Harappan tradition vanished. It moved with people. It persisted in habits and skills, the shaping of pottery, the care taken in domestic spaces, the organization of settlements, the memory of how cities once worked. In some areas, people might still build in brick where possible, still dig wells with Harappan expertise, still use motifs and styles inherited from the urban age. Culture can travel lightly. It does not require a palace to survive. This reorientation also changes interactions with neighbors. As Harappan communities settled in new regions, they would have encountered different groups, people with their own traditions, economies, and languages. Some interactions would have been peaceful and practical, exchange of goods, intermarriage, shared grazing arrangements. Others might have carried tension, competition over water, disputes over land, misunderstandings between communities. Over generations, these interactions would shape new regional cultures, blended, adapted, and distinct. Even within the old Harappan heartlands, the reorientation would be visible. As populations drift away, some areas become quieter. Fields may return to scrub. Irrigation channels may silt and disappear under dust. A traveler might pass through a once busy corridor and find fewer settlements, longer distances between wells, and a feeling that the land has exhaled and grown emptier. But emptiness does not always mean ruin. Sometimes it is simply a shift of human presence toward places that better fit new conditions. In a changing climate, people often follow the gradients of opportunity toward water, toward reliable rainfall, toward soils that still respond. The Harappan decline, in this sense, is less a story of defeat than a story of adaptation at scale. There is another gentle factor here: memory. When people move, they carry stories of why they moved. The old cities become part of family history, the place where grandparents lived, the place where certain crafts were practiced, the place where the drains once ran so clean. Over time, those stories can shape identity, even as the physical city fades. The ruins become landmarks in the imagination, as well as on the plain. As the map redraws itself, the Harappan world becomes less urban, more regional, and more varied. It is still connected, but the connections are thinner and they run along new routes. The center is no longer a single dense cluster of cities, but a scattered pattern of settlements responding to a landscape that is changing its terms. And as people spread into new territories, new kinds of pressures and frictions emerge, less about the maintenance of great cities and more about local resource competition, shifting alliances, and the quiet negotiations of everyday life between communities. We will step into that frontier atmosphere. We will consider how new neighbors and changing landscapes can create small, persistent tensions, rarely dramatic enough to leave obvious scars, but steady enough to shape decisions, migrations, and the slow transformation of a civilization. New neighbors, new frictions. In times of stability, borders can feel like lines on a map, useful but faint. In times of change, borders become something else, a daily negotiation. A grazing route crosses a valley where another community now keeps its herds. A water source that once served a handful of families is suddenly shared by many. A patch of land that used to be left fallow becomes precious. None of this requires armies. It requires only that the landscape's generosity becomes a little less certain and that more people begin to lean on the same places for survival. As the Harappan world dispersed and reoriented toward regions with steadier rainfall, toward new fields, toward different river corridors, its communities entered closer contact with neighbors they had once known only faintly or not at all. Even within the broad Harappan sphere, regional differences would have been real. Variations in language, custom, diet, and economic life. And beyond the Harappan sphere were other groups with their own patterns. Pastoral communities moving with herds, small farming villages rooted in local landscapes, traders who traveled between zones and carried news, rumor, and opportunity. The Harappan civilization at its height had been, in some ways, a culture of coordination. Standards of brick and weight, familiar seal motifs, shared craft styles. These suggested a broad agreement that made trade and interaction smoother across long distances. As that coordinated web loosened, interactions became more local, and local interactions are where friction, even gentle friction, can grow. Think of a small settlement forming near a reliable water source, perhaps a well-fed stream, perhaps a lowland that still holds moisture after the rains. At first, the settlement is small enough that the land can absorb its presence. Fields are planted, grazing is managed, and relations with neighboring communities are manageable. But over time, as more families arrive drawn by the same reliability, the settlement expands. The demand on water increases. Herds graze more widely. Wood is gathered farther from the houses. Now imagine another community nearby, perhaps older in that region, with its own traditions and expectations. To them, the newcomers might be both opportunity and threat. Opportunity because newcomers bring skills, crafts, and exchange. Threat because newcomers claim space, water, and attention. In such a world, conflict can emerge not as open warfare, but as disputes, arguments over access to wells, disagreements about grazing boundaries, tensions over marriage alliances, rival claims to a patch of fertile land. These kinds of frictions are rarely preserved in the archaeological record as dramatic evidence. They do not leave inscriptions. They may not leave mass graves. Yet they can reshape settlement patterns over time. A family chooses to move a little farther away to avoid conflict. A village decides to fortify its boundaries more carefully. A trade route shifts to avoid an unfriendly area. A community chooses a less ideal water source because the best one is contested. In the Harappan transition, such small-scale frictions could have contributed to the weakening of the old urban system. When resources tighten and people disperse, the benefits of living under a shared, standardized umbrella diminish. People begin to rely more on local alliances and local rules. Identity becomes more regional. The old Harappan symbols, seals, standardized measures become less central, as the main challenge becomes negotiating with immediate neighbors. There is also the question of movement itself. As populations shift, they do not travel as a single unified group. Different families move at different times, for different reasons. Some may be fleeing repeated crop failures. Some may be seeking better grazing. Some may be following kin ties. This means new settlements can be culturally mixed. Harappan traditions blending with local practices. Blending can be peaceful, even enriching, but blending can also create uncertainty about norms, whose rules apply, whose traditions are followed, whose claims are recognized. Over generations, such uncertainties can encourage communities to simplify. Instead of maintaining complex, long-distance standards, people settle into local systems that are easier to enforce and understand. Local measures replace standardized weights. Local building traditions replace strict brick ratios. Local symbols replace widely shared seal imagery. The result is not cultural loss in a simple sense. It is cultural branching, like a river delta splitting into many channels. External pressures may also have played a role, though the evidence is often indirect. Communities on the margins, pastoral groups moving through drier landscapes, might have faced their own stresses from climate change. If grazing lands shrank or shifted, these groups might have moved more frequently into agricultural zones, seeking fodder or exchange. This could increase competition and tension at the edges of Harappan settlement. Again, this does not require a dramatic invasion narrative. It can be a slow increase in encounters, misunderstandings, and low-level conflict. In a world of shifting water and shifting people, even trade becomes more complex. Trade thrives on trust and predictability. If routes pass through contested lands, merchants may avoid them. If local conflicts disrupt movement, exchange thins further. This feeds back into economic stress, reducing the surplus that supports craft specialization and urban life. And in the midst of all this, the old cities continue to shrink. They are no longer the centers that draw people in and bind regions together. Instead, the civilization's pulse is distributed across many smaller communities, each negotiating its own relationships and survival. The Harappan decline in this part of the story is not only about climate and rivers. It is also about social geography, how communities relate to one another when the old large-scale system weakens. The more local the world becomes, the more the old shared identity can fade into memory. Yet there is something quietly resilient in this. Local communities can be adaptable. They can innovate in farming and herding. They can form new alliances. They can create new cultural blends. The Harappan tradition, carried into these new contexts, can continue to influence how people build, craft, and organize life, even if the grand urban age is ending. We will look closely at one of the clearest markers of that ending, the unraveling of shared standards. We will explore how seals, weights, and uniform building practices, once the connective tissue of the Harappan world, became less common and less consistent, reflecting a society that was still alive but no longer held together in quite the same way. The unraveling of shared standards. There is a quiet power in agreement. When people across wide distances decide explicitly or simply through habit to build in the same way, to measure in the same way, to mark goods with familiar symbols, they create a world that feels coherent. A trader can travel and still understand the weight of a stone on a scale. A builder can shape bricks that fit with bricks made in another city. A craftsperson can recognize a seal impression and know something about the person who pressed it. These shared standards are not only technical details, they are the invisible threads that hold a civilization together. The Harappan world is famous for such threads. Standard brick proportions appear across vast regions. Uniform weights suggest regulated exchange. Seals carved with animals and signs appear in many places, hinting at a shared system of identity and transaction. For centuries, these standards seem to have been maintained with remarkable consistency. So consistent, in fact, that modern observers often feel the presence of a strong organizing force, even if the nature of that force remains elusive. And then, slowly, that consistency begins to soften. In the decline and transformation phase, the archaeological record suggests a reduction in the use of certain standardized elements. Seals become less common. The uniformity of weights and measures appears to weaken. Building practices shift toward more local variation, with less reliance on baked brick and strict brick ratios. This does not mean people forgot how to make seals or bricks. More likely, it means that the social and economic reasons for maintaining large-scale standardization were fading. To understand why, it helps to remember what standards require. They require connectivity. If distant towns are trading frequently, it pays to agree on weights. If builders are moving between regions, or if civic projects are coordinated across cities, standard bricks make construction smoother. If goods are moving through markets that reach far beyond local neighborhoods, seals become useful tools of trust, ownership, and administration. But if trade thins, if cities shrink, if settlement becomes more dispersed and regional, then the payoff of strict standardization diminishes. A village trading mostly with nearby communities can manage with local measures. A household building with local materials does not need to match a distant brick ratio. A regional market does not require the same seal system that a wide interregional network does. In a sense, standards are like bridges. They are most valuable when there is traffic. When the traffic declines, bridges still stand, but they are used less, maintained less, and eventually may be replaced by smaller crossings that suit local needs. The decline of seal use is particularly evocative because seals feel like the signature of a coordinated Harappan identity. They appear on goods and perhaps on documents that have not survived. They carry motifs, animals, symbols that likely held meaning within Harappan society. If seals became less common, it could reflect a decline in the administrative or merchant systems that required them. Perhaps fewer goods were traveling long distances. Perhaps fewer transactions required formal marking. Perhaps the institutions that manage storage and distribution were changing. There is also a human dimension here. Trust. In a stable urban system, trust can be institutional. A seal impression means something recognized across regions. In a more fragmented world, trust becomes personal and local. You trade with those you know, or with those linked through kinship or alliance. The seal becomes less necessary because the circle of exchange is smaller and more familiar. Weights and measures, too, can shift in such a world. Even a slight change in standard can create confusion in long-distance trade. But if long-distance trade is already declining, local variation becomes tolerable. A weight set in one region may not perfectly match another, but if goods are not traveling between those regions as frequently, the mismatch matters less. Over time, this variation can deepen until the old Harappan uniformity is no longer a defining feature. Building practices tell a similar story. Baked brick construction is resource-intensive. It requires organized labor and fuel, and it reflects long-term investment in urban permanence. In a period of environmental uncertainty, when water is less predictable, when fuel may be harder to gather, when populations are drifting, such long-term investment becomes harder to justify. People still build, of course, they always do, but they build differently, with mud brick, with stone where available, with reused materials, with structures designed for flexibility rather than for centuries. This shift is not necessarily a decline in skill, it is a change in priorities. A household concerned with the next harvest and the next monsoon may prefer a house that can be repaired easily with local materials rather than one that requires large-scale brick production. A community that expects to move if conditions worsen may not invest in the most durable construction. In this way, the built environment becomes a mirror of confidence. When confidence in stability fades, the architecture becomes lighter, more adaptable, more local. All of these changes, the fading of seals, the loosening of weights, the shift in building, suggest that the Harappan civilization's defining coherence was dissolving. But dissolving is not the same as disappearing. The culture did not vanish. It dispersed. It became regional. It adapted to new conditions. In many ways, this is what living cultures do. They do not die neatly. They transform into other forms. And yet, there is a melancholy in the unraveling of standards, because standards are a kind of shared promise. They are evidence that people once felt themselves part of something wide and connected. When those shared promises fade, the world can feel smaller. A person who once lived in a city tied into a broad network may now live in a settlement where the horizon of exchange is nearer, the sense of belonging more local, the rhythms more dependent on immediate neighbors and immediate rains. This shrinking of the shared world sets the stage for the next phase. What comes after urban life has receded, after the great cities have thinned, after the standardized system has loosened. What does life look like then? How do people organize themselves in smaller communities? What traditions persist, and what new patterns emerge? We will step beyond the bricks and drains of the old cities and into the quieter landscapes that follow. We will see how the Harappan legacy continues in village life, in regional cultures, and in the slow persistence of skills and memories, proof that transformation is not erasure, but continuity reshaped. After the bricks, life in smaller worlds. When a great city fades, the land does not become empty. It becomes, instead, more intimate. Where once there were crowded streets and layered neighborhoods, there are now smaller clusters of houses, scattered fields, and paths that wind around grazing grounds. The horizon feels wider. The sounds of daily life change. Instead of the constant murmur of dense urban living, there is the quieter rhythm of village mornings. Animals stirring, water being drawn, grain being ground, smoke rising in thin lines that drift away on the breeze. This is the world that follows the Harappan urban age, not a world without people, and not a world without culture, but a world where life is organized on a smaller scale. The famous brick grids and wide drainage systems are no longer the dominant pattern. In their place are flexible communities that can bend with shifting rains and changing rivers. From a distance, it might be tempting to call this a decline into simplicity. But for those who lived it, it may have felt like relief. In smaller settlements, the costs of coordination are lower. The dependence on distant trade is reduced. Food is grown closer to where it is eaten. Water is managed in ways that suit local conditions rather than citywide systems. When environments become uncertain, such flexibility can be a strength. This post-urban phase likely involved many strategies of adaptation. Farming patterns would continue to shift, responding to rainfall and soil. Communities might diversify crops more deliberately, balancing those that thrive with winter moisture against those suited to summer rains. Herding might become more prominent in some regions because animals can be moved when fields fail. Seasonal mobility, moving between grazing areas and fields, could become a more important part of life for some groups. Building styles reflect this new balance. In many places, houses might be made more often of mud brick and local materials rather than large-scale baked brick. Mud brick is easier to produce and repair, and it requires less fuel. Structures can be adjusted as family needs change. If a settlement needs to relocate after repeated drought or flood, the loss is less devastating than abandoning a massive urban investment. Even so, the Harappan legacy did not simply dissolve into mud and dust. It persisted in practical knowledge. The Harappans had learned how to dig wells and line them skillfully, and that knowledge could carry into village life. They had developed craft traditions, pottery forms, bead-making techniques, metalworking practices that could continue in smaller workshops. They had built habits of cleanliness and water management that might survive as domestic routines even when city drains fell silent. In other words, the decline of the city did not mean the decline of the person. A civilization's most enduring legacy often lies not in its monuments, but in its skills and instincts. How people cook and store food, how they organize households, how they shape tools, how they manage water. These are the kinds of things that can persist even as political and urban structures change. Trade, too, would not have vanished. It would have changed its scale and direction. Instead of long-distance networks linking the Indus world to far western markets, exchange might become more regional between neighboring settlements, between ecological zones, between herders and farmers, between inland communities and coastal ones. Regional trade can still be lively, still important, but it tends to produce more variation. Local styles flourish. Distinct regional identities emerge more strongly. This is where the Harappan world begins to resemble a river delta, many channels spreading outward, each carrying some of the old water, each shaping its own landscape. The shared standardization of the mature phase is replaced by cultural branching. Different regions develop their own pottery styles, their own patterns of settlement, their own mixes of crops and animals. And with branching comes blending. As Harappan-descended communities moved into new regions, they interacted with other groups, some long established, some also moving due to climate pressures. Over generations, intermarriage and exchange would weave new cultural fabrics. The result would not be a simple Harappan or non-Harappan identity, but a mosaic of communities shaped by shared ancestry and local adaptation. In the old urban heartlands, the great cities might still loom as ruins, brick platforms, and walls slowly eroding, wells filling with dust, streets becoming faint lines in the ground. Yet these ruins would not be meaningless. People could still visit them, salvage materials, remember them in stories. The ruins might become places of memory, of caution, of awe. Even without written texts, memory can persist in landscapes, especially when a child grows up hearing that the old city once had water everywhere, drains that ran clean, markets filled with distant goods. In the new, smaller worlds, social organization would likely feel different as well. Cities concentrate authority and coordination, even if that authority is not always visible as kingship. Villages organize differently, through kinship, elders, local councils, practical agreements. Decision-making becomes more immediate: when to plant, where to graze, how to share a well, how to handle disputes. The scale is human-sized, and in uncertain environments that can be an advantage. Yet there is also loss here. Urban life supports a density of ideas and skills. It allows craft specialization at high levels. It enables large public works. When cities shrink, some of that concentrated innovation and complexity can thin. Certain crafts that depended on large markets might decline. Certain building techniques might be used less often. The sense of being part of a vast, shared system might fade into regional belonging. Still, it is worth holding on to a gentle truth: collapse is rarely total. The Harappan transformation was a reshaping, not a disappearance. People remained, they adapted, they carried forward knowledge and traditions into new forms. As time passed, these post-urban communities would contribute to the broader tapestry of South Asia's later history. The Harappan world did not end and then begin again as something unrelated. It flowed into later patterns of settlement, farming, and culture, shaping the subcontinent's long-term development in ways that can be difficult to trace but are nonetheless real. We will move into the realm of memory and rediscovery. How later generations, both ancient and modern, encountered the Harappan past. We will consider how the civilization's ruins and traces entered human imagination, how the story was forgotten and then found again, and how the Harappan decline has become, in our own time, a lesson about resilience and the quiet power of environment. Memory, myth, and the long shadow of the Indus ruins have their own way of speaking. They do not speak in sentences, and they do not explain themselves. They speak in outlines and textures, in a line of bricks emerging from sand after rain, in a scatter of pottery on a dry slope, in a low mound that seems at first like a natural rise until you look closer and notice the careful order of its layers. For centuries after the Harappan cities thinned and the old urban systems loosened, the land still held these traces. Wind and flood softened them, but did not erase them, and human life continued around them. Fields plowed near them, paths worn past them, children climbing their slopes without knowing the full depth of what lay beneath their feet. One of the most haunting aspects of the Harappan story is how thoroughly it slipped from explicit memory. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus civilization left no long deciphered written records to carry its name forward. The seals and signs remain, for now, largely silent. Without readable texts, history becomes more dependent on other forms of memory: oral stories, place names, ritual associations, and the sheer persistence of landscape. It is possible that some echoes survived in ways we cannot easily detect. A ruined city can become a haunted place in local imagination, a mound associated with old spirits, ancient builders, or forgotten wealth. Such associations can shape how people treat a site, whether they avoid it, reuse it, or quietly respect it. A place with unusually baked bricks might become a convenient quarry for later builders, its materials repurposed into new walls, new wells, new roads. In that way, the Harappan city can continue to live physically inside later settlements, even if its name is lost. Across the long centuries, the Northwest subcontinent became home to many changing cultures and movements. Languages evolved, new political formations rose and fell, trade routes shifted again and again. In this long flow, the Harappan urban age became a deep layer beneath the surface present, but not always recognized as distinct. People living near old mounds might have known they were ancient, might have felt their strangeness, but not known the story of the civilization that built them. This is not unique to the Harappans. Human memory can be surprisingly short when it comes to deep time. Floods erase landmarks. Rivers change course and leave old settlements stranded. Wars and migrations disrupt continuity. Oral traditions transform with each retelling. Without writing that can be read across millennia, the names of cities can vanish even when the cities themselves remain. And yet, the Harappan legacy still shaped the world around it in quieter ways. Agricultural knowledge crop choices, water management instincts continued to evolve in the regions once touched by Harappan settlement. Craft traditions carried forward, altered but not wholly replaced. The very fact that so many Harappan sites existed across a broad area suggests that later communities inherited landscapes already shaped by earlier human decisions, cleared fields, altered drainage patterns, established routes. Even when the cities were gone, the imprint of their presence could persist in subtle changes to the environment. Then, much later, came the strange moment of rediscovery, not by ancient chroniclers, but by modern archaeology. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as scholars and surveyors moved through South Asia, they began to notice the mounds and the bricks. They encountered seals and pottery styles that did not fit neatly into the known historical sequences. The realization grew gradually, then more decisively. There had been a great urban civilization here, older than many had assumed, with cities of remarkable planning and reach. This rediscovery changed not only academic understanding, but broader cultural imagination. It expanded the sense of South Asia's deep past. It connected the subcontinent more firmly to the ancient world's network of early urban civilizations. It also posed a question that remains compelling. How could such a sophisticated urban system have transformed so thoroughly that its memory faded? In that question, the decline of the Harappans became more than a historical event. It became a mirror. Modern societies, too, build complex systems dependent on climate stability, water management, trade networks, and social trust. The Harappan story invites reflection, not in a fearful way, but in a thoughtful one. It reminds us that even the most orderly cities are partnerships with environment. It suggests that resilience is not simply the ability to hold steady, but the ability to adapt, sometimes by letting go of old forms. The causes of Harappan decline, seen through the lens of modern research, often emphasize this partnership. Shifting monsoons and changing river systems appear as long-term forces that reshape the conditions of urban life. Trade changes likely amplified economic stress. Local social pressures and health burdens may have made dense urban living less attractive. None of these factors alone needs to be decisive. Together, they form a layered explanation that fits the slow, uneven nature of the transformation. This layered explanation has also changed the tone of how we speak about the Harappans. Instead of imagining them as victims of sudden catastrophe, we can imagine them as people making decisions in the face of changing conditions, moving, adapting, reorganizing. Their civilization did not end because they failed to build well. It transformed because the world their cities were built for was slowly changing. And in that transformation, they left a legacy that is partly material and partly instructive. The material legacy is in the bricks, the seals, the pottery, the city plans, the wells. The instructive legacy is in the pattern, how environmental shifts can ripple into economic and social change, how urban systems depend on maintenance and trust, how people often respond to pressure not with dramatic collapse, but with gradual reorientation. As the Harappan story was rediscovered, it also became a place of wonder. It is hard not to feel awe when standing before the idea of Mohenjo-Daro's streets and drains, Harappa's long occupation, the breadth of settlement across plains and coasts. That awe can coexist with melancholy. The greatest achievements of human organization can fade, and the land can reclaim them, and for a long time no one may speak their names. Yet the land never truly forgets. It holds layers. It keeps traces. And when those traces are found again, they remind us that human history is deeper than any single tradition can remember. We will gather these threads into a quiet conclusion. We will return to the rivers, to the monsoon winds, to the slow movement of water across the plains, and we will let the Harappan story settle into its larger meaning, a reflection on resilience, adaptation, and the gentle passing of time. The rivers still move. A quiet conclusion. Near the end of a long day, the light over the plains turns honeyed and soft. Shadows lengthen along the low ridges and dry channels. Birds settle into reeds. The air cools, and the land seems to relax, as if it has been holding its breath through the heat. In such an hour, it is easier to feel the scale of time, how centuries can pass like slow weather, how cities can rise and thin again, how rivers can quietly take their own paths while human lives flicker briefly along their banks. The Harappan civilization's decline, when seen in this long, gentle light, does not feel like a single tragedy. It feels more like a transformation, one shaped by the deep forces that also shape the land itself. The story begins, as we have seen, with water and geography, a civilization built in partnership with river plains, seasonal rains, and the careful management of resources. It flourished when those conditions allowed a stable rhythm, enough predictability for surplus, enough surplus for specialization, enough coordination for urban planning, sanitation, and long-distance exchange. And then, slowly, the rhythm changed. The monsoon, so vast that it can feel like a permanent feature of the world, seems to have weakened or shifted in ways that mattered profoundly to farming and groundwater. Rivers and seasonal waterways altered their behavior, channels migrating, flows becoming less reliable, corridors of settlement gradually losing the water that had once sustained them. These environmental changes did not arrive like an axe blow. They arrived like the steady turning of a key. Over generations, they tightened the conditions of urban life. At the same time, trade, another kind of circulation, also seems to have thinned. Whether because distant partner regions changed, or because coastal and riverine routes became less dependable, or because surplus itself became harder to spare, the wide networks that had supported specialized crafts and urban prosperity grew weaker. As trade diminished, cities lost an important buffer against local scarcity. As climate variability increased, cities lost another buffer, the predictability that makes dense life comfortable and viable. Inside the cities, the strain likely became intimate. Sanitation systems that require constant maintenance became harder to keep perfect. Wells grew more precious, perhaps deeper or less sweet in some regions. Diets may have narrowed in difficult years. People who once trusted the city's order began to measure their lives against a quieter question. Where is it easiest to find clean water, dependable food, and a stable rhythm for children to grow? And so the cities began to shrink without battles, without dramatic ruins, but through decisions. Families moved towards smaller settlements, toward more reliable rainfall zones, toward new fields and new grazing routes. The civilization's map redrew itself. The Harappan world did not vanish. It spread out and became regional, branching into many local forms. With dispersal came the unraveling of shared standards. Seals became less common, weights less uniform, brick practices more local and flexible. The wide, coordinated system loosened not because people forgot how to build or measure, but because the economic and social traffic that made strict standardization worthwhile was no longer as strong. Standards, like bridges, are maintained when they are needed. When the flow changes, the bridges become quieter. What remained after the urban age was not emptiness, but continuity in new shapes. Villages, towns, and regional communities carried forward Harappan skills and instincts, craft techniques, domestic organization, water knowledge, while adapting to new environmental realities. Over the long span, these communities contributed to the evolving tapestry of South Asia, even as the names of the great cities slipped from memory. This is one of the Harappan story's most profound lessons. A civilization's end is not always a clean break. Often it is a shift of form, a rebalancing. The decline is not a disappearance of people, but a disappearance of a particular way of organizing life. Urban density, wide standardization, and long-distance exchange replaced by a pattern better suited to the conditions that followed. And in that, there is both melancholy and quiet wisdom. Melancholy, because it is natural to feel sorrow for what was lost. The grand cities with their careful drains and straight streets, the sense of a wide cultural coherence, the achievements of planning and cooperation. Wisdom, because the Harappan response, whether conscious or simply practical, was adaptation. When the world shifted, people shifted too. They did not wait for the old rhythm to return. They changed their lives to meet the new one. If you hold the story gently in your mind, you can see how it speaks to the modern world without becoming a simple warning or slogan. It invites humility. It reminds us that stability is precious, that water is a foundation beneath everything, that infrastructure is not a trophy but a daily practice, and that social trust, so easy to overlook, can be the quiet engine that keeps complex systems alive. It also reminds us that nature and civilization are not separate. Cities are built from landscapes. Economies are shaped by seasons. Trade routes follow coastlines and rivers and passes. Even the most orderly human plans sit within a wider world that moves on longer cycles. When those cycles shift, the human story shifts with them. And so we return, at the end, to the rivers. The Indus still flows, though its channels continue to change as rivers always do. Seasonal rivers still breathe with the rains, swelling and quieting. The monsoon still arrives, sometimes generous, sometimes late, always immense. The plains still hold their layers, clay and sand and salt, traces of old floods and old fields. And beneath those layers, the Harappan cities remain partly visible, partly buried, patient in their silence. If you were to stand at dusk near one of those ancient mounds, you might hear very little. Wind in dry grass, distant calls of birds, perhaps the far sound of water if it is nearby. And yet in that quiet, the centuries feel close. You can almost sense the old streets under the soil, the wells that once served neighborhoods, the careful hands that laid bricks in lines so straight they still astonish us. Time passes, empires fade, people move, rivers wander, and still human life continues, adapting, remembering in fragments, building again in new forms. The Harappan story becomes part of that larger human rhythm, not a single ending, but a long, gentle turning of the world.